In the heart of a remote and brooding forest in 19th century Germany stood the village of Dornwald, a place cloaked in whispers and shadows. It was a small community where everyone knew each other, bound together by tradition and the unspoken rules that governed their simple lives. At the edge of this village, separated from the modest cluster of thatched cottages and cobblestone paths, stood an imposing manor house that had seen better days. Its once proud walls were now cloaked with ivy, and its windows peered out like dark, watchful eyes. This was the home of Victor Hartmann, Dornwald's most brilliant yet reclusive resident. Victor was an inventor, known far and wide not just for his sharp intellect, but for the unusual nature of his creations. His mind was a fertile ground for the seeds of ideas that were both revolutionary and, some said, downright terrifying. Children would often dare each other to peer through the gaps in the manor's fence, catching glimpses of glinting metal, and hearing the strange sounds of gears and steam that whistled through the air like the cries of tortured spirits. Despite his contributions to the mechanical progress of industries far beyond the reaches of Dornwald, within his own community, Victor was an enigma, regarded with a mixture of respect and palpable fear. His interactions with the villagers were few and always tinged with an air of awkwardness, as if he spoke a language only he fully understood. Yet, none could deny the allure of his genius, which promised to lift the burdens of labor from their shoulders. Driven by a vision that consumed his every waking hour, Victor had isolated himself in recent months to undertake what he described as his most ambitious project yet. Rumors circulated among the townsfolk about the nature of this new invention. Some whispered it was a machine that could think like a man. Others feared it would be a weapon of terrible power. But in all this speculation, one thing remained clear. Victor was about to unveil something that could change the course of their lives forever. The season turned as Victor toiled away, the crispness of autumn giving way to the biting chill of winter. Smoke perpetually billowed from the manor's many chimneys, a sign of the fire that burned incessantly in Victor's workshop. Night after night, he labored by the erratic flicker of gaslight, his hands moving with a precision that made them seem more like parts of a machine than flesh and blood. As the pivotal day approached, the atmosphere in Dornwald grew thick with anticipation and dread. Invitations were sent, crafted in Victor's own hand, promising a demonstration that would be remembered for generations. On the eve of the event, as frost whispered across the windows of the village, the townsfolk lay in their beds with eyes wide open, wondering what the morrow would bring. The demonstration was set to take place in the village square at noon, but long before the appointed hour, the villagers began to gather, drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear. They spoke in hushed tones, casting nervous glances towards the road that led to Victor's manor, half expecting, half dreading to see what would come. And so, as the church clock struck 12, a silence fell over Dornwald. All eyes turned as the sound of heavy wheels and the hiss of steam announced the arrival of Victor Hartmann. He appeared atop a strange, covered contraption, large and imposing, cloaked in tarps that fluttered slightly in the winter breeze. Victor himself was a stark figure, his face pale and gaunt from months of relentless work, his eyes burning with an intensity that some later said seemed more mad than brilliant. With a dramatic flourish, Victor pulled away the tarps, revealing his creation to the village of Dornwald. There, standing on a platform of dark, polished wood, was a machine unlike any they had ever seen. It was a saw, but one of such size and outfitted with so many whirring blades and hissing valves that it looked more monster than machine. Victor called it the chainsaw, a tool designed to cut through wood with the ease of a knife through butter. The gasps from the crowd were a mix of awe and horror as Victor demonstrated the chainsaw's fearsome capabilities. As the blades tore through a log as if it were mere paper, the villagers could not tear their eyes away. Yet, beneath their fascination, a chilling question lingered in their hearts, a question of what such a machine might mean, not just for their work, but for their lives. Little did they know, the true impact of Victor's creation was yet to be felt. The morning sun crested over the village of Dornwald, its golden rays piercing through the lingering mists of dawn. Today was the day Victor Hartmann would unveil the fruits of his labor, a creation shrouded in mystery and speculation that had brewed restless anticipation amongst the villagers. As the clock in the church tower chimed the early hour, people from all walks of life, farmers, blacksmiths, homemakers, and even the curious youth, began converging on the village square, drawn by the promise of witnessing history. The square had been transformed overnight. At its center stood a large, makeshift stage built of rough-hewn planks, flanked by rows of benches borrowed from the local tavern and church. The stage bore the weight of Victor's concealed invention, hidden under a heavy, oilskin tarp that fluttered slightly in the crisp morning breeze. The air was filled with the murmur of voices, a blend of excitement and apprehension that created a palpable tension as the villagers speculated about the nature of Victor's secretive project. At precisely noon, as the last chime echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, silence descended over the crowd. All eyes turned toward the road leading from Victor's manor as the inventor himself appeared, pushing a cart with his veiled creation. He was a solitary figure, dressed in a dark leather apron, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a wide, oil-stained hat. With deliberate steps, he approached the stage, his presence commanding the rapt attention of every villager. With a practiced flourish, Victor pulled the tarp away, unveiling his creation to the gasps and murmurs of the crowd. There, on the stage, stood a machine of intimidating design and intricate craftsmanship. The chainsaw, as Victor proudly named it, was unlike any tool the villagers had seen. Constructed of polished steel and brass, it featured a long, serrated blade powered by a compact steam engine. The blade glinted ominously under the sun, its teeth designed to cut with mechanical precision. Victor began his demonstration by explaining the workings of the chainsaw. His voice, clear and impassioned, carried over the crowd as he detailed the efficiency it would bring to their woodcutting efforts. He spoke of the gears and the steam pressure, the safety mechanisms he had installed, and the potential to reduce the backbreaking labor associated with felling trees. As Victor prepared for the live demonstration, the crowd held its breath. With a nod to his assistant, the engine sputtered to life, emitting a low, steady growl that gradually grew into a roaring hum. The sound was both fascinating and terrifying, drawing a mixture of awe and a few scattered claps from the more mechanically inclined villagers. Victor placed a large log in front of the machine. Then, with a careful adjustment of the chainsaw, he engaged the blade. The noise crescendoed into a high-pitched scream as the teeth of the blade bit into the wood. Sawdust flew, and within seconds, the log was cleanly sliced through, falling into two neat halves. The demonstration was a resounding success, eliciting cheers and claps from the crowd, now buzzing with excited chatter about the possibilities. However, not all were swayed by the spectacle. Among the crowd, whispered concerns began to surface. Some spoke of the unnatural speed of the cutting, the way it made light of a task that nature had intended to require time and effort. Others muttered about the potential dangers, pointing out the fierce, unyielding spin of the blade that left no room for error. These murmurs of doubt were lost in the general cacophony of the crowd, but they persisted, sowing seeds of unease. As the demonstration concluded, Victor invited the villagers to come closer, to inspect the chainsaw under his watchful eye. One by one, the villagers approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution as they examined the gleaming metal and the still humming engine. Victor answered questions, expounded on modifications he planned, and reassured the more fearful about its safety. Yet, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village square, the initial excitement slowly gave way to a lingering sense of dread. The chainsaw, for all its promise of progress and efficiency, had introduced a new element to Dornwald, one that whispered of danger and the unknown. That evening, as the villagers returned to their homes, the echo of the chainsaw's roar lingered in their ears. Conversations around dinner tables were subdued, the community united in their awe but divided in their sentiments. Some slept uneasily that night, troubled by dreams of whirring blades and unyielding machinery, while others lay awake, pondering the ways in which Victor's invention might forever alter the rhythm of their daily lives. As Dornwald drifted into sleep, the first signs of a brewing storm whispered through the treetops, hinting at the turmoil that was yet to come. The chainsaw's introduction to Dornwald had stirred the air with an unusual energy, as though the forest itself held its breath, waiting to see what Victor Hartmann's invention would bring. The village, once quiet and unassuming, was now abuzz with both excitement and unease. At first, the awe inspired by Victor's demonstration filled the community with a sense of possibility. The chainsaw promised to reduce labor, to cut through even the mightiest of trees with the ease and efficiency that no axe or saw could match. For a village where lumber was the backbone of its economy, the potential was undeniable. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, the growing shadow of misfortune began to creep ever so quietly into the lives of the villagers. The first to take up the chainsaw in earnest was Klaus, a burly woodsman who had always been a leader among the lumberjacks. Known for his strength and experience, Klaus had been somewhat skeptical at first, but ever pragmatic. He saw the value in Victor's invention and agreed to test it for daily use. Victor, eager to see his creation in action outside the controlled environment of his workshop, handed over the chainsaw to Klaus, along with detailed instructions on its operation and warnings about its power. The first few days were met with surprising success. Klaus, along with his team of lumberjacks, marveled at how quickly they could fell trees that had previously taken hours of exhausting effort. The chainsaw became a tool of great pride for Klaus, a symbol of progress and power. His crew began producing more wood than they ever had before, and whispers of Dornwald's newfound productivity spread beyond the village borders. Even the nearby towns took notice, sending merchants to strike new deals for the valuable lumber. But it wasn't long before the initial euphoria wore thin, replaced by the growing weight of anxiety that pressed upon the hearts of those who worked with the machine. The chainsaw was powerful, too powerful in some ways. Klaus and his men found it difficult to control. The machine had a mind of its own, it seemed, jerking unpredictably in their hands when it hit knots in the wood, and at times kicking back with such force that even Klaus, with all his strength, struggled to keep it steady. The first accident came without warning. It was an early morning when Klaus and his team ventured deep into the forest to tackle a particularly large section of trees. The air was cool, and the sun had just started to filter through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As usual, Klaus revved up the chainsaw, its mechanical roar echoing unnaturally through the stillness of the woods. He positioned the saw against the base of a massive oak, one that had stood for generations, and began to cut. The tree creaked and groaned under the force of the saw, but just as Klaus neared the center of the trunk, something went wrong. The chainsaw hit a thick knot in the wood, causing it to kick back with such sudden violence that Klaus lost control for a split second, just long enough for the spinning blade to catch the side of his leg. Klaus screamed, a sound so full of raw pain and terror that it startled birds from the treetops. His crew rushed to his aid, but the damage was done. The chainsaw had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving a gruesome wound. Blood poured from the gash, staining the forest floor as they hurriedly bandaged his leg and carried him back to the village. By the time they reached the doctor, Klaus was pale and delirious from blood loss. Though he survived the ordeal, Klaus would never be the same. His leg was permanently damaged, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The villagers, once eager to embrace Victor's invention, now began to view it with suspicion. The chainsaw was no longer a marvel of progress, but a dangerous and unpredictable force. Yet, despite the accident, the lure of the chainsaw's efficiency was too strong for the lumbermen to abandon it completely. Work had to go on, and soon another woodsman, Hans, younger and less experienced than Klaus, took up the task of using the chainsaw in the forest. Hans was careful, mindful of the warnings passed down by Klaus and the others, but even caution was not enough to keep the shadow of misfortune at bay. Several weeks after Klaus's accident, Hans and his crew were cutting down trees in the same area of the forest. The day had started out well, and they had already felled several large trees by midday. But as the afternoon wore on, a strange sense of unease began to settle over the group. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of nature, seemed eerily silent. The only noise was the steady drone of the chainsaw, which grated on their nerves like the buzzing of a giant, malevolent insect. It was in this oppressive silence that disaster struck again. Hans, pushing through his fatigue, aimed the chainsaw at a particularly thick tree. As the blade bit into the wood, something snapped. The chainsaw jerked violently, more aggressively than any of them had ever seen before. It leaped from Hans's hands, spinning wildly through the air. In an instant, one of the nearby workers, a young man named Franz, was struck by the blade. The teeth of the saw ripped into his shoulder and chest, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. Panic ensued. The crew rushed to stop the bleeding, but Franz's injuries were catastrophic. By the time they carried him back to the village, Franz was dead. His lifeless body, bloodied and broken, was laid to rest that evening, and the entire village gathered in mourning. Fear gripped Dornwald after Franz's death. The chainsaw was now seen not as a tool, but as a curse, a creation that brought nothing but pain and suffering. Superstitions began to rise, with some claiming that the forest itself was rejecting the chainsaw, that the trees, ancient and alive in their own way, would not allow such a monstrous device to exist within their sacred boundaries. The whispers of a curse grew louder after Franz's funeral. Even those who had initially been Victor's greatest supporters began to question the wisdom of using his invention. Families pleaded with the remaining woodsmen to abandon the chainsaw, to return to the old ways of cutting wood by hand, even if it meant more work and less profit. For Victor, the aftermath of these events was devastating. Though he had always been something of a recluse, he had never intended for his invention to bring harm to anyone. His creation, born out of a desire to improve the lives of his fellow villagers, had become something terrible in their eyes. He could feel their stares whenever he ventured into the village, their eyes heavy with suspicion and blame. Victor retreated further into his manor, consumed by guilt and frustration. He knew the chainsaw was not inherently evil. It was a machine, nothing more. The accidents, tragic as they were, could be explained by human error, by the unpredictable nature of the forest. But the villagers were not interested in rational explanations. To them, the chainsaw was cursed, and by extension, so was Victor. In the weeks following Franz's death, Victor threw himself into his work, determined to fix whatever flaws might have caused the accidents. He modified the chainsaw, adding new safety features, reinforcing the blade, and adjusting the steam pressure to make it more stable. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The village no longer trusted him or his invention. A cold distance grew between Victor and the people of Dornwald, a chasm that deepened with each passing day. The chainsaw, once a symbol of progress and innovation, now hung over the village like a specter, its mechanical roar a haunting reminder of the lives it had claimed. And so, the shadow of misfortune continued to loom over Dornwald, casting long, dark fingers over the forest, the village, and the mind of Victor Hartmann. The events that had unfolded in Dornwald after the arrival of Victor Hartmann's chainsaw had already planted seeds of fear and suspicion throughout the village. Though the forest had long been a place of industry for the lumberjacks and a source of livelihood for the townspeople, it now felt like an enemy. The dense woods, once teeming with life and beauty, had become a looming and sinister presence. Whispers of curses and vengeful spirits circulated among the villagers, muttered in hushed voices after Klaus's injury and the tragic death of young Franz. However, it wasn't only the superstitions and accidents that began to trouble the village. There was an underlying change, something darker that no one could quite put their finger on. It was a tension that hung in the air, pressing down on everyone, like the heavy fog that sometimes settled over Dornwald. People avoided speaking openly about it, but it was there, gnawing at their minds, a palpable unease that permeated even the simplest interactions. For weeks, Victor Hartmann had retreated to the sanctuary of his workshop, the manor at the edge of the village, always a subject of curiosity and mild fear, had now become a place no one dared approach. Even the children, who used to sneak to the fence and peer through the ivy-covered gates, now avoided it entirely. The steam from Victor's machines billowed from the chimneys constantly, a sign of his feverish dedication to improving the chainsaw and making it safe. But the villagers no longer cared. To them, the chainsaw had taken on a life of its own, a cursed machine, indifferent to human suffering. In the days following Franz's funeral, Victor's isolation deepened. He seldom ventured into the village, and when he did, he was met with cold stares or nervous glances. The once proud inventor now felt the weight of the villagers' blame resting heavily on his shoulders. Their fear had turned into anger, and though they whispered about the accidents in corners and behind closed doors, Victor knew that his invention was at the center of their discontent. His intentions had been good. He had wanted to help the people of Dornwald, to make their work easier and their lives better, but the chainsaw had become something far different from what he had envisioned. It was around this time that Joseph, one of the village's most beloved woodsmen, took it upon himself to confront Victor. Joseph had been born and raised in Dornwald, his family having lived in the village for generations. He was a man of tradition, deeply connected to the land and the old ways of life. Though he respected progress and innovation, Joseph was cautious, and he had been wary of the chainsaw since the first demonstration. Nevertheless, he had not spoken out against it, believing that perhaps it was just a matter of mastering the machine and learning how to use it properly. But after the accidents, Joseph could no longer remain silent. The villagers looked up to him, and many came to him with their fears and concerns. The forest was not just their livelihood. It was a living entity that demanded respect. Joseph had always believed that the land gave as much as it took, and now it seemed to him that the forest was retaliating against the chainsaw, as if rejecting the intrusion of something so unnatural. One late autumn afternoon, with a cold wind sweeping through the village and the skies overcast with thick, dark clouds, Joseph made his way to Victor's manor. His decision had not been easy. He was not a man to start conflicts or raise his voice without cause. But something had to be done. The accidents had left the community in mourning, and even more concerning was the growing resentment toward Victor himself. Joseph knew that if the situation continued to fester, things could take a dangerous turn. The iron gate creaked as Joseph pushed it open, the sound echoing through the quiet grounds of the manor. The once well-tended gardens had grown wild, tangled vines crawling up the stone walls like skeletal fingers. The windows, dark and unwelcoming, gave no sign of life within, save for the constant plume of smoke from the chimneys. As he approached the heavy oak door of the manor, Joseph hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what he would say or how Victor would respond, but he knew that this conversation needed to happen. With a deep breath, he knocked firmly. There was a long pause, the silence broken only by the distant hiss of steam and the groan of machinery from within. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing Victor Hartmann, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and shadowed from sleepless nights spent in his workshop. "Joseph," Victor said, his voice flat, as though he had been expecting this visit for some time. "I didn't think you'd come." "I had to," Joseph replied, his voice steady but firm. "There's something we need to talk about, Victor. The village. It's falling apart." Victor stepped aside, allowing Joseph to enter. The interior of the manor was a stark contrast to its crumbling exterior. Though the decor was still grand and old-fashioned, the main hallway was filled with blueprints, gears, and strange mechanical parts. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of burnt wood. The manor felt more like an extension of Victor's workshop than a home, as though the house itself had become part of his obsessive drive to perfect his invention. They made their way to a sitting room cluttered with books and papers. Victor gestured for Joseph to sit, but Joseph remained standing, his hands gripping the back of a chair, his gaze fixed on the inventor. "Victor, I've come because people are scared," Joseph began. "They don't understand what's happened. The accidents, the deaths. Franz, Klaus, they've shaken this village to its core. I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen, but the chainsaw has brought nothing but pain and fear to Dornwald. Victor remained silent for a long moment, his eyes downcast as he listened to Joseph's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost defeated. I know, Victor said. I never wanted this, Joseph. The chainsaw, it was supposed to make things better, to make life easier. I thought it could help, that it would be a gift to the village. But now I don't know what it's become. It's more than just the accidents, Victor, Joseph continued, his voice more urgent. People believe the forest is rejecting the chainsaw, that something unnatural has been brought into our world. They're talking about curses, about vengeance from the land itself. I don't believe in such things, but the fear is real. And fear, when it takes root, can grow into something much darker. Victor looked up at Joseph, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Curses? Vengeance? These are just machines, Joseph. Mechanical tools, nothing more. The accidents were tragic. Yes, but they can be explained. Human error, perhaps. Maybe even flaws in my design. But curses? No. That's nothing but superstition. I understand that, Joseph said, his tone firm but not unkind. But it doesn't matter what we believe, Victor. The people are terrified, and they're starting to blame you. If something isn't done, if the chainsaw isn't put to rest, the village will turn on you. You need to understand that. Victor stood abruptly, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. I won't abandon my work. I've made improvements, corrections. The chainsaw can still help Dornwald. It's not the machine, it's how it's used. I can make it better. I can prove it's safe. Joseph sighed, shaking his head. It's too late for that, Victor. The damage has already been done. People have lost their lives. You've seen what happened to Klaus and Franz. This isn't about fixing the machine anymore. It's about stopping the fear before it destroys you and this village. For a long moment, Victor and Joseph stood in tense silence, the sound of the ticking clock in the background the only noise between them. Finally, Victor sat back down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. What do you want me to do? Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Joseph took a deep breath. You need to stop. Stop using the chainsaw. Remove it from the village. Take it out of the woods. Let people return to the old ways for now. Let the fear settle, and maybe, just maybe, they'll begin to forgive. Victor stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. And if I don't, Joseph met his gaze, his expression grim. If you don't, the village will turn on you. It won't be long before someone takes matters into their own hands. And I won't be able to stop it. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the weight of the entire village had settled between them. Victor knew that Joseph's words were not idle threats. The villagers had already begun to whisper in the taverns and around the hearths. Fear had turned to anger, and anger could easily become violence. After what felt like an eternity, Victor nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Joseph exhaled, relieved. Thank you, Victor, for your sake. I hope you make the right decision. Without another word, Joseph left the manor, the door closing with a heavy thud behind him. That night, as the wind howled through the forest and the village of Dornwald lay in uneasy sleep, Victor sat alone in his workshop, staring at the chainsaw that had brought so much pain. He didn't know what decision he would make, but deep in his heart, he knew the tide had already turned. The days following Joseph's visit to Victor Hartmann were fraught with an uneasy calm, as though the village of Dornwald itself was holding its breath. The once bustling streets grew quiet, and the villagers, wary and withdrawn, avoided discussing the chainsaw in public. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Fear, anger, and frustration had taken root, and the very air of the village felt thick with anticipation of something inevitable. Victor, despite Joseph's warnings, could not bring himself to abandon his creation. For weeks, he had been consumed with thoughts of failure, haunted by the possibility that his legacy, everything he had worked for, would be remembered as a curse rather than the revolutionary invention he had intended. He had spent sleepless nights in his workshop, making adjustments, recalibrating the chainsaw and improving its safety features, desperately hoping to prove its worth. Yet deep down, Victor knew it wasn't the machine's faults that had doomed it. It was a fear that stirred in the hearts of the people. Joseph's warning echoed in Victor's mind. The village will turn on you. One cold, stormy evening, Victor stood in the flickering light of his workshop, staring at the chainsaw resting on his workbench. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windows was interrupted only by the occasional roll of thunder in the distance. The villagers had already begun to distance themselves from him. Those few who had once supported him now avoided his gaze. The fear had taken hold. And Victor knew it was only a matter of time before the growing resentment would reach a breaking point. And that breaking point arrived far sooner than even Victor had anticipated. It was nearing midnight when the first signs of trouble came. Victor was hunched over his workbench, meticulously making another adjustment to the chainsaw when a loud crash reverberated from outside. He froze, the wrench clattering to the floor as the sound of raised voices and the crackle of burning would reach his ears. His pulse quickened as he realized what was happening. A mob had gathered. Victor rushed to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. In the distance, flickering torches illuminated the shadows of angry villagers as they marched toward his manor. Their voices were a muddled roar of rage, carried on the wind, but Victor could make out a few words: burn it down and curse. Panic surged through him. He had known this day might come, but he hadn't prepared for the reality of it. The chainsaw, now his most prized possession, sat on the bench before him, gleaming, motionless, and deadly. Victor's mind raced. He knew there was no convincing the mob, no reasoning with people who had been pushed beyond their limits by fear and tragedy. Without thinking, Victor grabbed the chainsaw. He knew the villagers would not stop until they destroyed everything he had built, including his life's work. If they were going to take it from him, he would not let it be without a fight. The roar of the mob grew louder, closer, and the orange glow of torches cast long, ominous shadows against the walls of his workshop. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he heard the iron gate crash open. The angry mob was on his doorstep. Victor bolted the workshop door and stood in the center of the room, chainsaw in hand. He knew the thick oak doors of his manor wouldn't hold for long, and the thought of the villagers breaking in, tearing apart everything he had created, filled him with dread. The rain hammered against the windows, as though the very heavens were urging him to act, to make a decision. Then the inevitable happened. A loud, splintering crack echoed through the manor as the front door gave way. The mob surged forward, led by a few men wielding axes and clubs. At the front of the crowd, Victor recognized familiar faces. Men who had once shaken his hand, who had praised his invention before it became a symbol of death. Now their faces were twisted in fury. "Victor," one of them shouted, "come out and face us. We're putting an end to this madness." For a brief moment, Victor considered surrendering, stepping out and facing the mob. But the weight of the chainsaw in his hands reminded him of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed to bring his invention to life. He couldn't let them destroy it. He couldn't let them destroy him. The door to his workshop shook violently as the mob tried to force their way in. Victor's grip tightened on the chainsaw's handle, his knuckles white. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. This wasn't just about the chainsaw anymore. This was about survival. The door splintered open and the mob flooded into the workshop, their torches casting flickering shadows on the walls. Victor's eyes widened as he saw their faces, a mixture of fear, hatred, and desperation. "Get away from my workshop," Victor shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "You don't understand. The chainsaw, it's not cursed. It's just a machine." But his words fell on deaf ears. The mob advanced, closing in on him with every step. Victor's hand moved instinctively to the starter cord of the chainsaw. In one swift motion, he pulled it, and the machine roared to life. The sound of the chainsaw filled the workshop, drowning out the shouts of the villagers, its mechanical scream echoing through the room like a beast unleashed. The mob hesitated for a moment, startled by the ferocity of the sound. Victor stood there, the chainsaw in his hands, its blade spinning menacingly, sending sawdust and sparks into the air. His eyes were wild, filled with desperation as he realized how far things had gone, how far he had fallen. "Stay back," Victor warned, but the words were futile. The mob surged forward, no longer caring about Victor's warnings or the danger the chainsaw posed. In the chaos that followed, torches were knocked to the floor, setting fire to the workshop's cluttered tables and papers. Flames licked at the walls, the heat rising quickly as the room filled with thick, acrid smoke. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as the workshop turned into an inferno. The chainsaw, still roaring in his hands, seemed to take on a life of its own, vibrating violently as Victor struggled to maintain control. The villagers were everywhere now, shoving and shouting, knocking over shelves and machinery in their frantic attempt to put an end to the chaos. In the midst of the confusion, Victor lost control of the chainsaw. It slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor, its blade spinning wildly as it skittered across the room. Sparks flew as it collided with a metal workbench, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. The flames consumed the workshop with terrifying speed, and the mob, realizing they had gone too far, began to retreat. But it was too late. The fire had spread beyond control, engulfing the entire manor in a matter of minutes. The heat was unbearable, the smoke suffocating. Victor, coughing and gasping for breath, stumbled toward the door, but the flames blocked his path. The chainsaw, still roaring in the center of the room, became little more than a background noise as the fire consumed everything in its path. Outside, the villagers stood in shocked silence, watching as Victor's manor burned to the ground. The once great house, the symbol of Victor's genius and ambition, was now little more than a blazing pyre. No one dared approach. They stood in the rain, faces lit by the flickering firelight, as the night of reckoning unfolded before them. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, nothing remained of Victor Hartmann or his workshop but smoldering ruins. The chainsaw, the invention that had brought so much hope and so much fear to the village of Dornwald, was reduced to ashes, its legacy lost in the flames. The village of Dornwald would never be the same. Though the fire had ended the immediate danger, the scars it left behind, both physical and emotional, would linger for generations. And as the villagers returned to their homes in the cold, rain-soaked night, they couldn't help but wonder if they had truly rid themselves of the curse, or if, somewhere in the ashes, the spirit of Victor Hartmann's invention still lingered, waiting to rise again. The fire that consumed Victor Hartmann's manor had long since died out, leaving nothing but cold, blackened ruins in its wake. Smoke had lingered for days, rising from the charred remains like the last breaths of a dying creature. The villagers of Dornwald, their faces etched with a mix of relief and remorse, gathered in silence the morning after the inferno to witness what was left of the place they had once feared. The building, once a grand but foreboding monument to Victor's genius, was now a husk of blackened stone and twisted metal. No one dared speak of what had happened that night. The mob, driven by fear and anger, had done what they believed was necessary. Yet, as the flames died and the echoes of their collective rage faded, a sense of guilt settled over the village. The once celebrated inventor, the man who had sought to bring progress to Dornwald, was now dead, and with him, any hope of reconciliation or understanding. The chainsaw, his cursed creation, had perished in the flames alongside him. Or so they believed. For weeks, the villagers avoided the ruins, refusing to go near the smoldering remains. The once busy road that led past the manor was now eerily silent, and the woods surrounding the property seemed to have grown darker, more sinister. It was as though the forest, still thick with ancient trees and twisted underbrush, had reclaimed the land in a final, silent act of vengeance. The villagers whispered that the ground where Victor's manor had stood was cursed, and that his spirit lingered there, bound to the ruins by the tragedy of his end. Life in Dornwald slowly returned to normal, but the scars of that night remained. The lumberjacks, once eager to embrace the future that Victor's invention had promised, returned to their old tools, felling trees by hand with axes and saws. The chainsaw, now considered a symbol of death and misfortune, was never spoken of again. It was as though the village had collectively decided to bury the memory of Victor Hartmann and his invention in the ashes of his manor. And yet, some things refused to stay buried. The first sign that something was amiss came several months after the fire, during a particularly harsh winter. The trees of the forest, heavy with snow, groaned and swayed under the weight of ice, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The villagers had always been wary of the forest during the colder months, when the paths became treacherous and the woods seemed more alive with hidden dangers. But this winter was different. The forest felt restless, as though it held within its depths a secret that was eager to break free. One evening, as the villagers huddled around their fires for warmth, a strange sound echoed through the woods. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the howling wind. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a low, grinding hum, mechanical and unnatural. It was a sound that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it, for it was a sound they had all heard before. It was the sound of a chainsaw. The first person to notice was an old woodsman named Wilhelm. He had been one of the few in the village who had tried to defend Victor, believing that the accidents were just that, accidents. He had been heartbroken by the tragedy that had unfolded, but had kept his thoughts to himself, unwilling to stir up old tensions. Now, as he sat in his small cottage at the edge of the village, listening to the distant roar of the chainsaw, his heart raced with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Wilhelm stood from his chair and moved to the window, peering out into the dark, snow-covered forest. The sound was unmistakable now, rising and falling in a rhythm that mimicked the familiar motion of a saw cutting through wood. But there were no lumberjacks out tonight. No one in their right mind would venture into the forest in such weather, especially not after all that had happened. The sound continued, growing louder with each passing minute, until it seemed to be coming from the very edge of the village. Wilhelm's breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, straining his eyes to see through the swirling snow. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence fell over the village once more, but it was not the comforting silence of a peaceful night. This was a silence heavy with dread, a silence that seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating and cold. Wilhelm stepped back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had heard. There was no denying it. The chainsaw had returned. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Several villagers reported hearing the same grinding roar of the chainsaw in the dead of night, always coming from the direction of the forest. Some even claimed to have seen a faint light moving through the trees, as though someone or something was out there working in the dark. But whenever they ventured into the woods to investigate, they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone having been there. Just the oppressive silence of the snow-covered forest. Fear began to grip the village once more. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more outlandish than the last. Some claimed that Victor's spirit had returned, angry and vengeful, bound to the forest where his invention had met its fiery end. Others whispered that the chainsaw had survived the fire, that it had somehow become possessed by a malevolent force, cursed to roam the woods, cutting down anything or anyone that crossed its path. The villagers, once eager to move on from the tragedy, now found themselves haunted by it. The sound of the chainsaw became a nightly occurrence, growing louder and more persistent with each passing day. The people of Dornwald grew anxious, unwilling to venture too far into the woods, even during daylight. Work slowed to a crawl, and the village began to feel the strain as the winter dragged on. Desperate for answers, a small group of villagers, led by Wilhelm, decided to confront the source of their fear. Armed with lanterns, axes, and a determination to put an end to the haunting, they set out into the forest one cold, moonless night. The air was thick with the promise of snow, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels as the group made their way deeper into the woods. For hours they searched, following the faint sound of the chainsaw as it echoed through the trees. But no matter how far they went, the source of the sound remained elusive, always just out of reach. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The wind howled through the branches, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the clearing where Victor's manor had once stood. The ruins were barely visible under the snow, but the blackened stones and twisted metal were unmistakable. It was here, in the shadow of what had once been Victor's workshop, that the sound of the chainsaw suddenly stopped. The group stood in silence, their breath visible in the freezing air. The clearing was eerily still, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet. Wilhelm, at the front of the group, took a step forward, his lantern casting long shadows across the ruins. And then, without warning, the chainsaw roared to life once more. It was louder now, impossibly loud, as though the very ground beneath them was vibrating with its power. The group froze, fear gripping their hearts as the sound grew closer, closer, until it seemed to be right on top of them. But there was no one there, no figure holding the chainsaw, no source for the deafening noise that filled the clearing. Just the ruins of Victor's manor, and the swirling snow that danced in the wind. The group fled, their lanterns swinging wildly as they ran back through the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the village, breathless and trembling. None of them spoke of what they had seen or heard that night, but the fear in their eyes told the story. The chainsaw, or whatever had taken its place, was still out there. And as long as the forest stood, so too would the haunting of Dornwald. The villagers, bound by their shared fear, lived in uneasy silence, knowing that some things, some horrors, never truly die. Even now, on stormy nights, the people of Dornwald claim to hear the distant roar of a chainsaw echoing through the woods, a chilling reminder of the past. It is said that the forest remembers, that it holds within its ancient trees the secrets of Victor Hartmann's invention and the tragedy that followed. And so, the echoes of the past continue to haunt the present, an eternal reminder of the man who sought to change the world, and a machine that refused to be forgotten.